Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Dr. Tracy Frederick, Executive Director of the Kansas School Board Resource Center, and Ward Cassidy, our Senior Advisor, is also joining us. If you are new to our webinars, just want to make sure that if you're not familiar with the Kansas School Board Resource Center, you should know that our mission is to help school board members be effective advocates for students to focus on improving academic outcomes. Now we'll have some time at the end of the presentation for your questions, so you can put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. If you don't see that Q&A box, there is a circle with three little dots. If you click on that, you can find it there, and it will then be placed at the bottom of your screen throughout the presentation. So just want to let you know that this presentation also will be recorded, so you'll receive a link to the recording to review and to share as widely as you choose. And as always, I'll send you the link to the recording and we will archive it on the workshop video section of the KSBRC webpage. This afternoon, we are pleased to have with us again Aaron Salt, the Executive Vice President for School Boards for Academic Excellence and author of Govern Differently. He has founded and chaired a charter school. He has served as elected school board president, and has led district operations as COO and also served as interim superintendent for a district. He has implemented programs that have driven measurable results, including increased student achievement, expanded CTE certifications, and strategic budget management during fiscal crisis. He has done a lot, and he also holds a degree from Auburn University and Florida State University. Today, Aaron will discuss the important responsibility the board has in evaluating the superintendent, crafting a process and an evaluation tool that is student-focused and promotes a culture of accountability, trust, and shared vision for student academic achievement. Making sure the board and the district leadership are focused in the same direction, share the same vision and priority to advance academic achievement, preparing students for college and careers that is so essential for student and district success. Well, I don't want to get into too much of what Aaron will discuss, so I am going to turn it over to Aaron and let you take it from here.
Awesome. Thanks, Tracy. I really appreciate that introduction and really excited to be here with everyone again. And before we get going here, I also just want to thank all of you on the call. I know the work that you're doing in your districts, and it is just an incredibly important job. And so I appreciate everyone stepping up, volunteering, being in that role, and still taking your time out of your day to come and continue your education and do better for your students. And I just applaud you and appreciate the work that you're doing. So with that, like Tracy said, we're going to talk about superintendent evaluation and goal setting and how that actually benefits your students, your district. What we're going to cover today is what a good executive evaluation actually looks like, governance and the board's role versus the district's role and why it's important, the 4A's framework, setting goals and benchmarks, and then we'll talk a little bit about your specific state framework and what that means in relation to the conversation we're having today. So first up is what an executive evaluation looks like. What I've seen often is board members that are elected have never been in a role where they're evaluating an executive level employee. They're used to your frontline workers, middle management, and they've never even participated in what an executive evaluation looks like. And it's a different type of thing than most people are used to. And so it's important to understand why that difference exists and how that actually works here. So first of all, you're not actually looking at individual effort. Your superintendent can try and can try and can try, and they can do work well on their own. However, that doesn't matter. What matters is organizational outcomes. And organizational outcomes here for school districts is directly tied to academic outcomes and academic achievements. You want to see how well your students are performing. Again, this is the scope of the entire organization's academic performance. Some people like to take principal evaluations and assume that it'll work for your superintendent, and that's not the way it works. Principal's roles and superintendent roles are very different roles. And so you have the scope of everything, which includes your elementary and learning how to read, all the way up through your CTE programming, certifications, and graduation rates, and everything in between. Strategic goals, outcome data, and community trust. These are things, this is a unique position because you can have pretty much any other role. And it's all about individual effort, individual performance, and a lot of times communication within an organization. Very little does it actually talk about building community trust and that outward perspective. And that's critical here, not just because of the district. And I'll talk a little bit about how that benefits your kids a little bit later, but you're also a public institution. And so you have to build community trust through your taxpayers, your parents. There's a lot of stakeholders. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit, but that this is a unique role that's really external focused as well as internally operational. And so understanding what that executive evaluation looks like and why it matters is a really good lens to process the rest of this evaluation template and the evaluation process. The next sort of background piece is that governance role, what the board's role is versus what the administration's role is. And I try to keep it pretty simple, where the board focuses on what and why, and let the administration focus on the how. I know when I was on the board, I wasn't in the district all the time. I didn't have an office with a nameplate. I showed up once or twice a week, kind of walked through a couple things. We went through our board meetings, and I talked to the high level superintendent. I talked to cabinet. I got into schools when I could, but understanding the day-to-day operations and how some of those discussions, how some of those decisions flows down and how it actually gets implemented is really hard for you as a board to understand, and it's not your role because you have people that are there to fix that how and to show how this gets implemented operationally. Your role as a board member is to focus on the what and the why. These are values-based perspectives. What are we trying to accomplish? And why are we trying to accomplish it? And once you can dictate those two things to the superintendent, they have a clear vision on how to create the how of getting that what and why done. And so, just a couple of examples here. I like to think of a captain on a ship. That's your role as a board. You don't actually steer the boat. You're looking at the map, you're charting the course, you're saying this is where we're trying to go. This is how we need to get there, and everyone else kind of manages what needs to be done. The captain's not letting the sails down, right? They're not steering the boat, they're not chopping potatoes, they're not swabbing the deck. They are setting course, they're setting the direction, and that's your role. You need to be able to articulate the purpose. Students first, community trust, public accountability. These are core, values and core what's that you need to be focused on in this process. Evaluation criteria, setting goals. I'm not going to read this whole slide, but really looking at what and why versus the how. And with that, that leads into the 4A's framework. This is the core of the evaluation, which I have the template. I'll show it to you. Tracy will send it out later. And so, but this is the core part of it, and it's the 4A's framework. It's academic performance, attainment of goals, adherence to policy, and associations in the community. First and foremost, academic performance. Remember, you are an organization that is there to support students and to support learning. When you talk about organizational outcomes, this is the key metric here is how are kids performing? And you don't want to just say, pick one metric. You're not looking at third grade reading every single year. You're not looking at graduation rates every single year. You also want to look at different demographics. You want to look at different levels of student groups. I know when I was on the board, our lowest performing group year over year were our SPED students. And so at some point, you as a board have to say, we have to pick this up. We have to figure out a way to increase our SPED performance. And now that's a really big thing. I'm not an expert in special education. I'm not an expert in a lot of the services that need to go on for our SPED students. But I know when our outcomes include SPED students and they're the lowest performing, that's where you have the most room to grow and the most room to really impact overall performance by looking at those outliers. Another data point I like to look at is not just third grade reading year over year over year. That's an important metric, but I also like to look at core cohorts, or what I call diagonal data. I call it diagonal because when you look at a grid and you have grade level and by year, it ends up making a diagonal because they're in second grade one year, third grade the next, fourth grade the next, fifth grade the next. And so you can follow that cohort to see if there's anomalous data through that process. If you look at how they performed in second grade and look at how second grade's been performing overall. And then you look at how they performed in third grade and how third grade's performing overall. And then you look at fourth grade for that cohort compared to the rest of fourth grade, you can see some fluctuations and you can see trends. And so making sure that you're asking questions about that academic data and those different levels of student groups will help you understand how to set these academic goals to help find where those holes are and that you can start to plug them and you can start to fix the achievement gaps that you're starting to see before they become larger problems. If you see a little bit of a dip in one year, you can address it quickly instead of seeing that cohort drop year over year over year and that gap get bigger and bigger and bigger. And then by the time they're in seventh grade, that's a really hard task to overcome. That bubble eventually hits your graduation rates. And so like that these pieces flow together. And so the earlier you can identify that, the better you are. And so that's why you want to have these not just academic performance globally, but looking at specific student groups, different specific data through that process to identify those gaps as early as possible and set goals around those. The second part of the 4A's framework is the attainment of goals. Again, you want to tie your academic performance to the goals. And so the performance side is what it is. It's objective, how we're trending. The attainment of goals is saying, okay, we looked at the data, we know how we're trending. Now we're translating that into expectations in meeting these goals. And so there's this transition from the academic performance to the goals work, and then whether or not they're able to attain those goals becomes part of this evaluation cycle. And I talk about three different parts of this: meeting the goal, missing the goal, and a critical miss. And I'll talk more about that when we talk about goal work in a handful of slides here. The third part is adherence to policy. I'm a firm believer in accountability and building a culture of accountability. And if you don't have that level of accountability in making sure that your superintendent is meeting their goals and that they are adhering to policy, then that's a really bad precedent to set for the rest of the organization. If you can't hold yourself as a board accountable and you can't hold your superintendent accountable, then it's really hard to have an expectation that the superintendent's going to hold anybody else accountable on down, down to the principals, principals to teachers, teachers to students. And so setting that culture from the very top and setting clear expectations is important. When I was on the board, we've had a Carver's policy governance model, which provides four different buckets of board governing policy, and then how many ever administrative policies you want. And part of that process was having a monthly evaluation of one of those buckets is executive limitations. And so it kind of sets up what's permissible and what's impermissible for the administrator as they're executing. When you talk about the how, right, the superintendent and the administration handle the how, you want to put some guardrails around that. Anyone can increase funding and flow through if they're, doing nefarious things and bringing money in. And so you have to be very clear that we're not going to use illicit opportunities. Most states have laws about what's uh, permitting students and your obligation as a district to educate the students that are in your district. And so an easy way to fix graduation rates is don't accept the problem kids. But you could be violating state law by doing that. And so you have these executive limitations. I like to think about it. I'm an analogy guy. I like to think about it as a field goal, right? In football, uh, when someone is kicking a field goal, there are three lines that kind of dictate what the bounds are: too far to the right, too far to the left, and too low. But anywhere in this box, it counts as 3 points. It doesn't matter if it bounces off the upright, if it ekes over, or if it's sky high right down the middle. It's all worth 3 points. And so your executive limitations are setting up the bounds of what's permissible for a 3 point and what's no good. And so this is where your policy comes in. Those are the executive limitations. With the Carver model, they provide an opportunity for updates on how the administration is following policy. And they'll say, we were compliant with policy for these reasons. They have data to support it. And so when you get to the end of the year, when you're doing your administrative evaluation, you can look back and see that your superintendent was compliant with policies throughout the entire year. Each of the executive limitations that were set, they followed, they were compliant with. Or you'll see that they weren't. And so it's easy because you've had these regular check-ins month after month after month to know so you're not at the end going, gosh, I think we did okay. They provide statements to you. When your financial policies, they bring up the audit, right? There's all of these data points that they can have that demonstrate their compliance with the framework that you've set of what's permissible and what's impermissible. And then the fourth part here is associations in the community. And I talked about this just a couple minutes ago, but you have a lot of stakeholders. You have your students, you have your teachers, you have your parents, you have your taxpayers, you have your businesses that are in the district that are taxpayers and parents, most likely. And a lot of times, the primary chunk of your funding is coming from your commercial properties, not your residential properties. And so, keeping businesses happy and making sure that they're in a good place and they're supportive of the district is important because you don't want them moving to a different district and giving their money to someone else. Number one. Number two, this has a direct impact on student performance. When I first came on the board, we had a superintendent who was fairly isolationist. We were a good district, we had great grades, and we didn't need anybody in the community. We're going to put our head down, we're going to get to work, and we're going to do what we need to do. And it was fine. We maintained a solid reputation, we maintained strong academic performance through that time. But the business community knew we weren't partners here, and we've got a um, very strong business community that looks for these strategic partnerships. And so he retired, and we hired a new superintendent, and she was very intent on these community relationships to the point that we actually were able to stand up. We got a bond passed, set up a new high school, and part of that was a whole new CTE center. Part of that funding was coming from some of our strategic partnerships that created with businesses there. They're, data companies that are looking to help, provide the next generation of people who know how to use computers and programming and business analytics and tying all of these pieces together. We have medical place that donated a lot of medical equipment to make sure that the training they were getting, and then they're able to hire students right out. And so not only were our students now getting certifications they didn't have opportunities to before, it didn't cost the district and the taxpayers a ton of money because we had these strategic partnerships because of the relationships that the superintendent built with the business community. We were gifted equipment, we were gifted money and funds to stand some of these programs up. And then it cycled back through where we had an automotive program where we had people hiring out of state for our high school kids that were coming out of our automotive program because of how strong it was. You want to talk about opportunities. I mean, you're talking about high school kids who are making 25 to 30 bucks an hour straight out of high school. That's a direct turnaround right back into the community, feeding the economy. And so all of that stems from the relationships that you as the board and the superintendent are able to make with the community. And so if anybody tells you that being an isolationist is okay, I completely disagree. You really need to have these strategic partnerships and make sure that you're accounting for all of the stakeholders in your district, and your superintendent is the person who's accountable for that. And so these are the 4A's framework. And again, these get to be fairly objective things. When you're looking at testing data, it's objective. When you're looking at the goals, they either met it or they didn't. Did they meet policy or did they not? These are fairly objective criteria, which feels constraining for some boards because they want to have a little bit more. They don't like the way that this happened or that happened. So the template that I have that Tracy will send out also has this narrative section. Talks about areas of strength, areas for improvement, and areas for follow-up. The areas of strength are there for things above and beyond, right? You don't want to say that the superintendent did a great job evaluating principals. That's their job. Their job is to evaluate principals. The fact that they got it in on time is the expectation, right? We don't want to say you did a great job, like just doing your job. You want to commend the things that are truly extraordinary, like with our superintendent who was able to help raise money for an entirely new CTE center. That's above and beyond what your average superintendent is going to do. Areas for improvement are things that could be contractually problematic or problematic for the superintendent's contract. Things that would have an impact and say, this is where we're breaking our contract, we're moving a different direction. We wish you the best of luck. These are big issues that come up that really need to be observed. And this is to help you create a paper trail. So if there's any sort of a legal issue, you've got it tracked on these evaluations cycle after cycle after cycle. The areas for follow-up is just the things that don't rise to the level of contractual issues. What I like to advise people is if this is the first evaluation cycle that something's come up, put in your areas for follow-up. Then you've got it noted. The board can look at it the next cycle. The next cycle, if it's gotten better, wonderful. If it hasn't gotten better, then it can move to an area for improvement. And so you're showing this progression of this was an issue. We talked about it. It was not resolved. It became a bigger issue. And so you build this ocean of evidence, if you will, around these problems. So when it's time to term a superintendent for cause, you actually have data that you can go back to and talk about. You can talk about, going back here to the framework, they weren't meeting goals. They were not doing well academically for the district. They didn't adhere to policy. And again, tracking these things are really important. Uh, I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but you really have to be careful not to get into like the politics side of this and identity politics, playing these games. Like this needs to be, I've seen the first evaluation cycle I did when I was on the board was probably a 12 to 16 page report from the board to the superintendent that clearly identified one of our board members had a personality conflict with the superintendent. It wasn't about the job, wasn't about politics. They just didn't get along. And so because they wanted to make sure everything was tracked, I kid you not, it was a close to 16-page report, and we had to do something differently. And this is kind of how how this whole framework kind of came about. Uh, but now I want to move over, and we talked about the template itself. Those are the main sections, the 4A's framework, and then this narrative section combined together. It gives you the objective and the subjective, making sure that you can track true issues and provide actual commendation for what's being done and being done well. But I want to talk about goals, and not just goals, but benchmarks too. There's two different levels that I like to talk about. Uh, if you've been in any sort of a corporate setting in the past, I don't know, 2 to 3 decades, you've heard them talk about SMART goals. And there's a reason it's a great framework for setting those up. A couple of the key differences here, though, is when you're setting goals, they're time boxed. You want to set a goal, you get through it, you set a goal, you get through it. And so they're kind of this progressive trend. Benchmarks are important because they actually set a standard. They're not time boxed. You say, this is what the expectation is, and we're not going to go below that expectation. Um, for an example, I was on one board, and when I showed up, the first budget we got was almost 30% expenditures over revenue. And I went, this isn't even like a draft budget. I don't know. This is a mistake. I don't know what to do about this. The next one they brought was about 8% over, and most of our board was cool with it. And I said, this is not the expectation. The expectation is we're going to have an even balanced budget. We're a public entity. We're going to have a balanced budget moving forward. We owe that to our taxpayers. And so for the past 6 years now, that district has put forward a balanced budget year over year because that was the benchmark that we set. That was the expectation and the standard that was set by the board for the administration. That's not a goal. That's the expectation. And I think that's the real difference between these and why both of them are important. I know most states have different kind of accreditation ratings. And so saying, we're not going to be below 4.5 stars, we're not going to be below 85% on these evaluation ratings or whatever it is that you use in Kansas, make that an expectation. You want to set that. That's the benchmark for performance for the district. And then your goals help move you progressively in very strategic ways. For instance, and we'll talk a little bit about this more as we go on, but this third grade reading, moving it from 65 to 70% over the course of a year. It's a great goal. If I'm going to use that here as an example as we talk about the acceptance thresholds. So we're just going to talk through a scenario here where you're on the board, you've set the expectation that third grade reading will move from 65 to 70% next year. You're at the end of the year, and you look at the results, and third grade reading is at 71%. Well, shoot off the confetti cannons, man. We are set, goal met, we're moving forward. That's awesome. Now we'll set the next one and say we're going to get to 75, 76. But what if you don't hit 72%? What if you don't hit 70%? look at 69%. Well, 69% is a pretty close. It's improvement. We didn't meet the goal though. Is that okay? Like, are you going to punish your superintendent because they hit 69% instead of 70%? Is that a contractual issue? What if they hit 66%? It's improvement. It's not a lot, but it's still improving. Is that a problem? What if they go to 64%? What if you actually go down? Is that a problem? So you have to understand what your thresholds are and what you're going to accept and what you're going to allow. And that's why I break it down into goal met, miss, or critical miss. And I'm not going to tell you what a critical miss is. I have my own opinions on that. But if you hit 70% or more, you meet the goal, you're good to go. If you're at 68%, you might say that we missed the goal. That's not good enough, but we're not going to, slap the ruler on the superintendent's knuckles because we still saw some pretty strong improvement through that. If you're at 66% or 64% or below what you even started at, that's a different kind of conversation. That's a critical miss, and that shows a problem with the way that your district performed over the course of that year. Now, there could be excuses or causes or correlation that you can look at and point to and say, we changed curriculum and the teachers were not equipped enough to do this. And so there could be an explanation for why that went down. But those are get to be very difficult and very important conversations to have. But you don't want to get here at the end of the year, see 66%, and then try to figure out what to do with it. You as a board need to know kind of what these acceptance thresholds are going to be for each of the goals that you're setting to know when you get there, it's objective. We get the test results back, it's at 69%. We're not happy, but we're also not trying to oust the superintendent because of it. If it's 66%, you need to know what you're going to do with that. And so those are not conversations I would necessarily have with the superintendent because you don't want them aiming for 68% if they know 68% is going to be good enough. You want them aiming for 70%. Um, but you as a board need to have those conversations and understand what those thresholds are going to be as you move forward. And so now we'll move on to the actual evaluation cycle. Some districts do once a year. Most states require a minimum of once a year. My recommendation is doing twice a year. And the reason why is you need those regular checkpoints. You don't want to wait to the end of the year to address issues. And this gives you a cycle for actually making some corrective action. And it actually works pretty well when you look at the calendar. And so we do it a little backwards. Most people think that you would do this tied to the school year, but you actually want to tie it to the calendar year, and I'll explain why. So the example that we have here is that July and August is kind of where you have your initial goal setting. You look at kind of last year's data, you think about where you want to go, you set the goals, you want to set them up front. You don't want to change these middle of the year. You don't want to spring new goals on the superintendent in December. It's too late for them to make any changes and really move things. And so you want to make sure that you've got clear goals set in that July, August timeframe. October, November, quick check in. You see how things are going. You'll have your beginning of year data. You can kind of see, make sure that everything's trending the way that you want it to. And then in December and January, you'll have your annual end of year summative evaluation. After that, you move on. And then in that May, June timeframe, you'll actually look back. You'll have your mid-year evaluation, your formative. And at that point, you can do some other course corrections, and that gets you set up to start having conversations about end of year data and circles back around to July, August, and having your goal setting for the next cycle. The reason why you want to do your annual is number one, a lot of your contracts actually stipulate that it'll be done in January, depending on where you are. And that gives you as a board, if you need to change directions, if your superintendent is no longer meeting the needs of the board in the district, and you need to make a change, it gives you, as the board, time to find someone for the next school year. If you decide to term your superintendent in June and you've got the new school year starting in July, that is doable, but it is not ideal. And frankly, most of the quality superintendents probably already have contracts for the next year. And so what you're looking at are the B tiers, right? You're not looking at your wide receiver ones, your running back ones. You're looking at the guy who barely made the team. And there are good people out there. Don't get me wrong. I mean, you can always find people, and if it's the right fit, I've seen people not jump early, but quality superintendents that wanted to wait because there was a specific job or district that they were looking for. So you can find quality people. But the normal cycle, the way that you want to try to trend this, especially to give you as a board enough time to look at candidates and truly vet out what this needs to look like for your board or for your district for the following school year, give them enough time for a transition and a plan to come in. You need to be looking at that starting early in the calendar year. And so you have to make that decision December, January timeframe. It's also courteous to the superintendent that you're terming because they likely have a family that they need to take care of, and it gives them an opportunity to go out and find a new contract as well. If you cut them in June or July, you'll end up paying them severance, and then there's probably nothing out there for them until the next cycle. And so it puts a lot of strain on them. And then we get more consultants, and that's nothing that the world needs is more consultants. And so that's why you really want to try to trend this evaluation cycle is hit your formative in that mid-year, in that June timeframe, and then cycle back around to where you have your summative end of year evaluation in that December, January timeframe. So after that, we'll talk quickly about the specific Kansas framework. And Tracy, if I say anything really, really dumb here, you are welcome to chime in and correct me. But Kansas does not have a stipulated template or format that you have to use as a board. There is criteria that you need to follow. There are specific items and things you need to evaluate through this process, but there is not a specific template or format like some states are very prescriptive in how that evaluation is done. And so with this, you can adopt this evaluation form straight out. It's one page, and I'll pull it up really quick and show you. It is a one page. I mean, this is pretty much all of it. You got your academic performance, attainment of growth and goals, were the goals met, were they critical misses, adherence to policy, associations in the community, strength for areas of strength, areas for improvement, areas for follow-up. This is a one-page template. It doesn't get much more simple than this. And what I like about this is even if you don't want to adopt this particular evaluation form, it starts out with a framework. It helps give you a place to start in developing this that's going to provide objective criteria. It's going to tie it into academics between your goals and the actual performance that you're looking at. And even if you have a different template, this helps frame the conversation, making sure that you can use this almost as an outline for how that evaluation process needs to go. I believe Kansas requires the opportunity for a superintendent to do a self-evaluation. And so you can give them this and say, we want to see where you think you are on all of these things. And we as the board will do our own evaluation and then we'll compare notes. But this also sets the tone for the superintendent's self-evaluation that these are the things that we care about. These are the things that are important to us as a district and to us as a board. And so having this evaluation template, whether you want to use it or not, and it's free for you to use, it's at least modifiable and helps frame the conversation, talking about what your priorities are going to be. All right, we're wrapping up here. I know we're getting close. Couple pitfalls is having vague or unmeasurable goals. You really want to focus on SMART goals. You want to have baselines. You want to have named assessments. I know for my district, we had 3 different assessments, standardized tests that we gave our kids every year, and they didn't always correlate on the results. And so you want to be very clear. If you're saying 65, moving from 65 to 70% in 3rd grade reading, which test are you going to use as a measurement? Because you could hit it for one and miss it for the other. And so you don't want the superintendent saying, oh, I thought we were going to use this other one because I actually hit the goal when we did this one. So name the assessment. You don't want to have an evaluation disconnected from academics. Remember, tie those goals in. And if we have time, Tracy, I'll circle back and I've got that goals template that I can share. But you want to make sure that it's tied together, and you want to make sure that student achievement is named and weighted if you're doing kind of a weighted component. You want to make sure that you have mid-year reviews and check-ins. You don't want this to be just sort of an ambush on the superintendent. You don't want to change criteria mid-year. I worked with one board where they didn't set their it was not a school board, and so they were using a calendar year, and they didn't actually dictate what the superintendent or the CEO's goals were until April. You've taken almost half the year away when you're telling them what to do. So planning and actually implementation is so truncated at that point. And so you want to make sure that you have these, what the evaluation criteria and what those goals are going to be set beforehand and make sure that they're solid. Another pitfall is not linking your evaluation to compensation or renewal. Uh, I know in the reform education space, we talk often about pay for performance for teachers, but not many people, not many boards actually talk about pay for performance when it comes to the superintendent. You have these goals, you have these academic outcomes, incentivize them to do well, incentivize them to meet those goals, and provide some sort of a bonus for achieving what the board's setting out. And then the last part here is not letting the process be driven by politics or driven by personality issues. You want to make sure that they are objective and reflective on the performance of the organization and not personality conflicts. You don't want to persist that kind of a friction at the individual level. So last thing here, just some reflection questions is, does your current evaluation process have academic performance as a named and or weighted component? When were your superintendent's goals set? Who set them, and are they measurable? I ask that because I've seen many boards where the superintendent hands the board their list of goals and say, these are the goals for the next year. And the board says, thank you for sending those over. We'll see how you do next year. And that's so backwards. These goals need to be set by you as a board, not by the superintendent. Are the evaluation criteria written down and shared with the superintendent before the year begins? If you're going to move to this type of a template, hand them the template ahead of time and say, this is what the evaluation criteria is. This is how you're going to be evaluated in the next cycle. Has your board actually connected evaluation outcomes to compensation or contract renewals? And then finally, what would change in your district if the superintendent's evaluation and compensation was rigorously tied to student outcomes? How do you think that would actually impact your community, your students? So, Tracy, thank you for the opportunity. I'll turn it over and see if there's any questions.
Well, thanks so much. Appreciate all of that great information. I wonder if you wouldn't mind going ahead and diving in just for a moment into the goals. I think that might help to kind of really bring all of this together, and then we'll open it up for some questions.
Absolutely. So this is it's done in kind of a PowerPoint presentation style. And I like it that way because then you can kind of just copy and paste from one to the next. You create as many slides as you have goals. And so I'll start up here. So this is completely pretend, but you could set it up where you have these type 5 different strategic areas, 5 different areas for goals. And notice not all of these are academic, but most of them are. And we've called out specific areas between math and ELA and specific student populations. We said SPED is a problem. And we need to make sure that we address this. And so these are the different goal areas. Well, once you get down from that goal area, so you have your high level, we're talking about math or we're talking about SPED. We'll list each one of the goals. It could be 1, it could be 2, it could be 5. You don't want to go too crazy on this, so I'll caution you, but you could have some of these strategic priorities kind of codified into these goals. And then for each one, you write down what the measurable part was, what the target was, what the actual result was. So for here, we would say, the goal was 70%, we hit 71%. And so we said we met it, and then next year's target, we'll say we hit 71, we'd like to try to hit 75 for next year. And this creates a methodology for transparency because this is pretty like the target was 70, the actual was 71. Yes, we met it, and this is what we want to try to get next year. If you, I'll move to the next slide because I've got an example of did not meet. So we can say our goal was 70, actual was 68. Next year's target is going to be 72. And rationale, justification, explanation is needed. So let's say we have 68, implemented new curriculum. And so it gives an opportunity to explain why we didn't quite hit what it was. And, this could be anything under the sun. It's up to the board whether that rationale or justification is necessary and if it's sufficient. Because, if you went from 65 and you actually went down to 64%, and then they said we implemented a new curriculum, the board may say that's not justification for having such a large drop. If that's the case, why are we spending money on new curriculum? Like that's we're not seeing any benefit from this, and it costs us a whole lot of money. And so this is just a format, a template for how to translate those goals into the a transparent format for your community, for your all of your stakeholders. Present this at a meeting and tell the superintendent, all right, you're going to do your presentation on goals in the next month, and this is the format we want you to use. And again, it's a transparency measure that comes in, lists out exactly what the goal was, and then provides you kind of that template for saying what we were trying to accomplish, how far we actually got, what we want to try to hit next year, and if there's any justification needed. And so it's pretty simple. It doesn't help define what those goals are because I mean goals can span the universe here of what people want to try to accomplish. But it does provide you this format for kind of taking those goals, making it transparent, making it easy to understand, and reporting out to your community to make sure that everyone, all of your stakeholders are aware of how the performance of the district is going and the superintendent. This could work really well for the superintendent. This could be really problematic, but it's your call as a board to make sure that those metrics are being reported out. If you go through a contract cycle, you continue to give your superintendent more money, and you don't have a transparent way of saying why you're giving them more money or why you're doing these contract renewals, um, it doesn't look like you're doing your due diligence in doing this. And so this is actually, again, we talk about accountability. This is from the board's perspective. This is from the superintendent's perspective. You want to make sure that transparency is a core part of that accountability.
Excellent. Well, thank you. That's very helpful. I know it's a practical tool and wanted to make sure everybody saw that. Ward, do you want to begin with any questions? I have a few here, but if you would like to lead us off, you're welcome to.
Okay.
Oh, you're muted. There you are.
Now you can hear me. Uh, Aaron, that was fantastic. I had the opportunity last week to have a coffee with superintendents, board members, some golf tournament. So you get to talk to lots of different people. I would say in the western half of the state, superintendents drive the evaluation process way more than school boards, way more. And I mean, superintendents can be caustic in that type of environment when we're talking, but we're not about to let our board decide what the heck our goals for the next year are. How would they know? And that's why I hope, as every school board member that's listening to this, if they would follow this process, uh, they certainly could do a better job with student outcomes. And that's what we're all about. And that's why we're involved, why you're involved, SBA. But then the other comment was diagonal tracking. I used to do that. I think that's one of the most valuable tools. And I actually asked that question. How many of you guys do diagonal tracking in your elementary reading programs? None. None. They worry about third grade reading scores. They don't know. Well, what happens when they get to fifth grade? You might be more alarmed when you see
Right.
what's happening because they couldn't read at third grade. But so anyhow, diagonal tracking is important, but this whole process, I thought you did an excellent job. I wish we could make a state law that they had to follow these procedures, and those worksheets are invaluable. And then the last thing is the new board members that were there and we're talking, they don't even know what the evaluation process is until they're on the board for a year or two.
Yeah.
So if you're a new board member listening, I think that's the first meeting that you're on should be requested. What evaluation process? Because these guys, the superintendents, are leading the school districts. And if we don't know what's expected of them, you're not going to have any results. So fantastic job. Let's make it a state law. And I'll quit.
Well, I appreciate that. And one thing that I'll add is I've gotten pushback from boards saying, well, what about my superintendent? Will they go along with this? And I've got two comments. One is, well, they work for you. So if this is what the board wants to do, then do it. But two, the superintendents that I have shown this template to have appreciated the objective criteria
Right.
and how simple it is. It does not provide opportunity for those political and personality conflicts to come in, and it really keeps things focused where it needs to focus. And so I actually have had pretty positive reception from both board members on the simplicity and ease side and how little time it takes to complete. And then also from the superintendents because of it being more objective and not allowing the personality conflicts to overtake that process.
Well, that's one thing that I noted, Aaron, and with the question is not really a question, but a comment, just as you said, it seemed like it would be a benefit to superintendents because everything is transparent. They know exactly what they're being evaluated on, and it is not personal and it's not political. I know that there is a district that uses a evaluation form that's like 26 pages long, so it's just so burdensome. And it really does not get at the overall objectives of the district. And so the superintendent is spending weeks and weeks trying to fill out this evaluation form when that can really take them away from, in those, small little details, take them away from the larger goal that they're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, no, very much so. And so one of the things that I was really proud of when I was our board president is I cut our meetings down from we had what about 18 meetings a month or 18 meetings a year to we had about 10, 11 meetings a year. And we got a lot of pushback from the community because they were complaining about transparency. But what I told them, I said, listen, every board meeting we have takes at least one day of all of cabinet focusing on me and my board versus focusing on the principals and the students that they serve. So anything I can do to free up their time to focus on the students and supporting the teachers and the principals versus supporting the board, I will take that trade-off every time. And so when you're talking about a 26-page evaluation form, the superintendent is tied up on things that really aren't helping support the students' achievement. They're not there to help support, or they're not available to help with the principals or the teachers. The people that they're there to actually serve and support, they can't do when they're supporting the board.
Exactly. So I have a practical question, a couple of questions here, but first of all, so you've laid out this great process. You have different time frames in which this would, be these benchmarks and these touch points on this evaluation with the board. And really what I see as developing a strong partnership between the board and the superintendent, less adversarial, much more how do we work together, which would then allow the board to have conversations with the superintendent about resources, about issues that are going on, to really focus all the attention toward improving academic achievement. So when you think about implementing this, I mean, this all sounds great. We are here in the end of May, beginning of June. What is the runway that you would advise the board? We have some board members who are watching this that are first-time board members, or there's some change in superintendency. So, what would you advise them on implementing something like this in this process?
That's a great question. I would have a conversation with your superintendent and your other board members to say, I think we can do better. I think we can make this objective. We want to make this transparent. We want to make it, easy for everyone involved to report out what really matters. And so, different boards have different policies. Some of them actually codify the superintendent evaluation, and so this requires a policy change. Our board didn't. We could pretty much willy-nilly do whatever we wanted to when it came to evaluations, templates and formats. And so I would bring it up. I would talk to the other board members. I mean, if you're talking about this, then you could hit the mid-year cycle, but I would caution you on that because of how late it is, that it might be best to just stick with what you have right now. Introduce the idea of making a shift now, but don't actually make the shifts. Go through the goal setting process and then work through to where your first the summative evaluation that comes up in that December January timeframe would be on the new format. But it gives you an opportunity to set goals now before the school year gets into play. It lets you start looking at the data, but without an immediate urgent change to it. So stick with what you've got for this next upcoming cycle. But if you're only doing one a year, I would say we need to transition this to a mid-year now and not go into a full summative. Hit that as a mid-year cycle, set your goals now, and that way you can transition to something a little bit simpler, and that gets you on that new evaluation cycle schedule pretty quick without introducing too much change into that process at one time.
Great. Well, thank you very much. The next question that I have has to do with you talked about the strategic partnerships. You talked about how when you were on the board that you develop all these partnerships with, not only community members, but those who were, had businesses and industry in the community. So I'm just wondering if you would talk for a moment about was this involved in some part of this evaluation or did it play in any part of that?
The biggest place that it played was when you look at the 4As, it has that associations in the community.
Mhm.
And I can pull the template back up really quick. Let me share so I can show you what we're talking about. But it's got this part down here where it's got the associations of the community. And so you can talk through what this actually means. Areas of strength would be another place that you could codify that. The way we started developing these, and I say we, that it was the district, is the superintendent started holding stakeholder meetings with community business members just to say, here's kind of what we're doing as a district. Well, what do you think? How does that impact you? What do you need from us? We did a big thing between our board and the business community on what are the soft skills that they see lacking in the new employees that they're having move through. And so we framed it really as what do we as a district need to try to help our students learn? How do we educate them better, both hard skills and soft skills, to make them better employees as we move forward? How do we make them into better community members as what are you looking for in this process? And then we already had some CTE programming, and we invited community members in like once a quarter and actually showed them what we had, the capabilities we had, and how that could impact what they were doing. And that's what sparked some of the ideas and some of those the strategic partnerships with some of our local businesses was they got an idea for how we had worked with other businesses to create these CTE programming. They knew where we were going as a district. They knew we were invested not just in graduation rates, but in the entire economy of our local business community and making sure that our students were known for being the biggest, the best, and the brightest in that space. And so that's really kind of how this developed. And so it's hard to codify all of that, right? And so marking good is really almost an undervaluing of what that can be done. But that's where this areas of strength is to really have those commendations specific to what's going on through that process and noting what is working and how they're going above and beyond to generate opportunities for your students.
Well, that I guess is the question when you talk about codifying, is that, when you look at students, you can look at the performance evaluations to determine whether they're reaching the goal or they're meeting that goal or they're missing the goal. So when you think about strategic partnerships or businesses, taxpayers, how would you be able to assess that? Or is there some way in which you've assessed that in a way that would be helpful for determining other than a personal self-evaluation that a superintendent might bring to that, is there something that you could um, kind of put a framework around or point to that would be helpful?
Um, Talking about from like how do you codify relationships?
Well, how would you assess whether your superintendent is meeting that, is making those associations? Is it what they're doing, the kind of activity that they are involved in the community?
Yeah, okay. Great question. Getting involved in the community is one. Our superintendent sat on probably two different community boards, maybe three. So that was one. Two, because of the stakeholder meetings that she was hosting with the community members, you could look at attendance. If there were two or three people coming, that shows that things are neutral or maybe even need to improve. When you have 25 people in the room, that looks different, especially if they're cycling, right? If you have 25 people, it's not the same 25 people, and so you're generating interest. There's different ways that you can kind of look at that. Another thing you can do is you can send out I hate saying surveys, but like you can do some polling with the community on what that looks like. I mean, business community members love to be involved and they love to be included in these types of conversations. And so um, it's not hard to find ways to track some of these things It's just a matter of what's important to your board as far as is it the community involvement and serving on boards? Is it having those stakeholder meetings? Is it setting up programming? Is it, what are the things that you want to see? And so those can translate to goals. Um, if you want, or they can just, like I said, be a little bit more subjective based off of the types of work that they're doing and the results they're seeing based off of the community relationships. I actually had community members who I would see in other places from other boards that I served on, and I would talk to them and say, "Oh, the superintendent you guys have is the best one that we work with in our county." And so, like having that unsolicited feedback that talks about how much more willing she is to invest in the community relationships versus these other superintendents, that goes a long way. It's really hard to hear a few of those. It wasn't just one. I mean, I got several comments that were unsolicited from community members that I saw that I interacted with. And so it became pretty easy to say, we're doing a great job, or she's doing a great job on these community relationships based off of that. I would caution you not when you start looking at these other these other associations, parents, the people you're going to hear from the most are the people who have problems and frustrations. And so make sure you're putting that into perspective. Like we would have our board meetings, we'd have the same 25, 30 people that showed up to every board meeting, 10 or 12 of them, maybe 15 would speak and just get all upset. And 90% of the time it was at the board and not at the superintendent. A few times there were superintendent issues, but even still, we've got a district of 26,000 students and we have a problem that's big enough that 20 people are here. Like the magnitude of the feedback we were getting was just not significant, that it felt very manufactured versus being authentic and real, because most of them were fine. But our superintendent also had stakeholder groups with students. She had stakeholder meetings with taxpayers. Just she had one that it was, I forget what she called it, but they were taxpayers in the district who were over 65 and trying to reach out to that particular group because they're voters and they're highly impacted based off their property values on the performance of the district. And so making sure that she got feedback from that community group and that wasn't something that she developed. That wasn't something that we had done before. And I thought it was just a phenomenal idea in really establishing relationships with a community group that we had neglected over the past few years. We focused so much on parents that we missed some of the other people who are no longer have students going through our district. So there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of track that and see kind of how those data feed into this type of an evaluation cycle.
Well, that's very helpful. One of the reasons why that question was asked is when you think about what you talked about, removing the personal and the political, so that you're not just listening to the loudest voices, or you are allowing for some kind of a, cross referencing and understanding of how that superintendent is talking with and becoming involved with the community at large or taxpayers at large. So that's very helpful. Thank you so much. Well, we are
Absolutely.
at the end of our time. It has been a wonderful webinar. We want to thank you again so much, Erin, for coming on and discussing superintendent evaluations. I know that this is something that you've been working on for a long time, and it was just excellent. We appreciate your insight and your expertise in committing to essentially long-term success with boards and with superintendents to create a strong partnership. For those of you who do not know, I didn't mention this earlier, but we are an affiliate of the School Boards for Academic Excellence. And for those of you who also don't know or may not be aware, the School Boards for Academic Excellence houses our Kansas Legal Hotline attorney who helps Kansas school board members. So thank you so much for coming on, Erin. We appreciate all the good work you do at SBAE. I know there's a conference coming up this summer, and for if anybody's going to go to that or join us there, we look forward to seeing you there. And if you need anything, I'm sure that Erin can help you out with that as well, or you can talk to me and I can certainly get you in touch with Erin about this topic or something else that might be helpful to you.
Thanks, Tracy. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Ward. Thanks, Erin. And thanks so much for everybody for joining us. We will have another webinar coming up next week on Tuesday, June 2nd. It will be a COMA training webinar with Matt Bingsesser from the Kansas Attorney General's Office. And so he'll be providing that training. And also on Wednesday, June 17th at noon, we'll have an informational webinar on the Mississippi Miracle, and another webinar will be coming up on the Kansas legislation that was just passed and all the policies that will be coming from that. If there are any topics that you would like to hear a little bit more about, some information about, please don't hesitate to reach out, let us know, and we'll see what we can do about putting together a webinar for you. Thanks so much for joining us today. We hope you have a great rest of your day.